We have today a fireside chat with Vilma Martínez and Thomas Saenz, both of MALDEF, and our moderator is going to be Celina Moreno, a former MALDEFian. And so I'm going to introduce Celina, and then she will introduce Vilma and Tom to you. We're so pleased to have this group of really esteemed legal experts. And Celina is somebody who we've been so fortunate to have speak at a couple of MACRI events. I know MACRI will often say this, but it's just so true. We're so fortunate in San Antonio to have this amazing group of civil rights leaders, whether they're currently here in San Antonio or whether they were raised here, born here, passed through here. But this really has been, as we often say, the cradle of Mexican-American civil rights right here in San Antonio. So Celina is part of that story, that history. She's currently the president and CEO of IDRA, a national nonprofit dedicated to equity and excellence in education. She previously directed policy and litigation for the Southwest Regional Office of MALDEF, the nation's leading Latino legal civil rights organization. She chaired the Texas Latino Education Coalition and the Joint Education Task Force Caucus, of the Texas Senate Hispanic Caucus and the Mexican American Legislative Caucus. She also served as co-chair of the statewide Trust Coalition, a group of businesses, faith, and civil rights and law enforcement leaders focused on immigrant rights, and the Texas Election Reform Coalition, a statewide voting rights coalition. Before joining MALDEF, she directed Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid's program School to Prison Pipeline Project. She's a 2018 German Marshall Fellow, and she's also the recipient of the Center for Public Policy Priorities 2017 Future of Texas Award, which is given to a visionary young leader who has made a demonstrable and valuable impact on Texas's, on Texas. It is a great pleasure to introduce her, because I know you've met her before at previous MACRI events, but if we could have Celina come up here and be joined by Vilma Martínez and Thomas Saenz, we will get started.
Good morning, buenos dias. Can everybody hear me? Is the mic on? All right. Hi. Welcome to this conversation about the 50th anniversary of the 1975 expansion of the federal VRA, or the Voting Rights Act, and its legacy today. Thank you so much, Sarah, and to the MACRI staff and board for hosting this conversation today. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Celina Moreno. I'm the president and CEO of IDRA. And IDRA was founded here in San Antonio in 1973, along with many other national Latino civil rights organizations like Southwest Voter Registration and Education Project, like Avance, and like MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. We have two amazing and heroic MALDEFians here today with us, and it is my distinct honor to moderate this conversation today with Tom Saenz and the Honorable Vilma Martínez. You can read their full bios in the program and on the MACRI event website, But I just want to share a few highlights, and of course, we'll get to hear in their own words some of the reflections on their incredible careers. So first, the Honorable Vilma Martínez. Vilma is a trailblazer, one of my sheroes, and she is the second president and general counsel of MALDEF. She was the first woman to be the president and general counsel of MALDEF. She was also appointed by President Barack Obama as a U.S. ambassador to Argentina and served in that role from 2009 to 2013. She's also the first woman to hold that post. MALDEF is, as Sarah mentioned, the nation's leading legal Latino voice for civil rights, and it was also a driving force for the expansion of the VRA in 1975. MALDEF has litigated so many impactful voting rights cases to protect the voice of our community, and we're going to hear about some of those today. Also with us is Tom Saenz, who is the current president and general counsel of MALDEF. Tom was also the lead attorney for MALDEF in its successful lawsuit to stop the implementation of the anti-immigrant and anti-Latino Proposition 187 in California, which I think for so many of us, we see that case as changing, having monumental shifts in what the voting and Latino political power looked like in that state. That's just one of many cases that Tom has led. During my time as a MALDEF attorney, I got to actually be in the U.S. Supreme Court while Tom was giving oral argument in defense of MALDEF's clients who were immigrant parents related to the DACA, the expanded DACA and the DAPA program. And we like to say at MALDEF, once a Maldefian, always a Maldefian, and I certainly still see Tom as my president and general counsel and as a fearless leader for the Latino community. And we're just so extremely privileged to have them here with us today. So please help me give Tom and Vilma a very warm welcome. So before we dive in, I just want to do level setting with some very quick facts. Latinos have been the largest minority group in the US for over 2 decades. We represent over half of the population growth since the last 2 census counts. And in the 2024 election, 1 in 5 Latinos voted for the first time. In some places, we're seeing some amazing momentum to reduce barriers to voting, like online voting registration, like same-day voter registration, like registration and voting by mail. But in other places, including here in Texas, we continue to see lawmakers and others continue to try to dim that Latino voting power by disinterest in investing in Latino voter outreach, by disinformation, and by, as Tom has framed it, the dilution, the denial, and the deterrence of the Latino vote. The 5 Ds, if you will. And that is attempted through a range of policies and actions that I'll ask Tom to break down for us. But anything from voter intimidation to voter ID laws and to largely fabricated claims of voter fraud, gerrymandering. So we'll hear about many of those things today. And roughly 13 million eligible Latino voters remain unregistered, which is a problem, but also an opportunity because once registered, we actually tend to vote at relatively high rates. So just wanted to do a little bit of level setting. Vilma, there are a lot of negative stereotypes about how Latinos don't vote, but that I think really can overshadow sometimes just how hard the struggle was to make sure that Latinos get to fully participate in our democracy. And so I'm really glad that you are here to share your story, to share the important story of the Latino civil rights. And this year we're commemorating the 60th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, which led, of course, to the VRA. We know that that brought Black voters, Latinos, and others critical protections, but not many people know about the significant barriers that remained for Latinos after the VRA's passage, and particularly Spanish-speaking voters in the Southwest United States. You led MALDEF when it successfully convinced Congress to expand the Voting Rights Act. And can you just take us to that moment, the context, and what happened?
If I know how to turn this on. Or is it on? Is it on? Oh, it's on. Great. Well, we're talking about the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and more specifically, the extension and expansion that occurred in 1975. The 1965 Voting Rights Act was called the most successful piece of civil rights legislation ever passed, registering over 1 million Black voters, and it resulted in the election of over 1,000 Black elected officials in the South. That was 65. But it had a sunset clause, so it's going to disappear in 1975 unless it was extended. So MALDEF gets involved in the 1975 extension to try to expand it to include Mexican Americans. So that's what we're talking about here today, that 50th anniversary. And it was interesting because I didn't have the education and the good sense to know that we had a voting rights problem. And when Al Bettis from the DC office said we needed to get involved, I said, don't we have a lot of other issues to deal with? He didn't say anything to me, but he sent me a huge packet of information from the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Sound familiar? Documenting abuses of Mexican Americans who tried to register to vote. They would try to register to vote. All of a sudden, their forms weren't available. And on Spanish language television on election day, there would be public service announcements saying, do not vote unless you're duly authorized and qualified to vote, lest you subject yourself to fine and possible imprisonment. So that was the reality that many people were facing. And so starting in 74, we began to gather the facts with Southwest Voter Project, young attorneys, Tom Reston in Washington, D.C., and the MALDEF attorneys who were working here at the time, gathered all the information. It was an interesting experience for me personally, because it was the first time I personally was engaged in that sort of Washington, D.C. effort. And, you go in there with your set of facts, but then you confront the reality that's in Washington, D.C. So I expected to get the support of the NAACP. I expected to get the support of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. Unfortunately, Clarence Mitchell, who was head of the D.C. office of the NAACP, opposed supporting what were called the Chicano amendments because his concern, and it's a valid concern, was that it would prejudice the constitutionality of the act, invite another challenge to the constitutionality to go all the way to the Supreme Court, and then it would all be lost for everybody. So I argued in front of them that, as a lawyer trained at the Legal Defense Fund, that if there was this challenge, there is a severability clause and we could be severed out. But anyway, fortunately, although he prevailed at the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights and they did not support us, the people who did support us were the Japanese American Citizens League and Joe Rao, a very well-connected labor lawyer, and the Congressional Black Caucus. They did support us. Mr. Civil Rights, Don Edwards from San Jose, was reluctant to support us, but fortunately the American GI Forum paid him a visit to explain how important it would be for him to support this amendment to the Voting Rights Act. So that's pretty much how it passed.
Thank you. Thank you for grounding the conversation today, and just, the incredible legacy. We owe so much to your work and to the work of
before I forget, I heard this impressive city councilwoman this morning. We heard the story even now. Her grandmother, who didn't want to vote even though she could because she thought there were still poll taxes.
So we owe a lot to Vilma and her allies at the time. and I think the generation of civil rights leaders and lawyers, we build on that. And Tom, you are leading the charge now. Tell us what we need to know about what is happening around current legislative efforts around the VRA.
Well, first, I think that we need to recognize how significant the achievement in 1975 was, because we need to recognize that the 1965 Act did not apply to Latinos. And that is because the 65 Act prohibits voting discrimination on the basis of race. And in 1965, no legal entity in the country considered Latinos to be a race. So simply by limiting the prohibition to race, it excluded the entire Latino community. Now, there was a small provision designed for Puerto Ricans who were educated in Spanish language schools on the island or elsewhere, and protected their voting rights in 1965. But other than that, the law did not apply to Latinos. So early cases on voting rights did not use the VRA for our community. They had to rely on the Constitution and the Constitution alone until the expansion in 1975. And people sometimes bring their current vision where, by and large, Latinos are treated as a race, that we have controversies now on the census and otherwise about how to formally categorize the Latino community. But back then, there was no debate. If it was a prohibition of discrimination on the basis of race, it simply didn't apply to discrimination that was being experienced in the Latino community. And that's why the 75 reauthorization and its expansion was so critical. It really made the Voting Rights Act available to us. Now, Vilma has been my professional mentor since I was in law school, so I have heard stories about the Voting Rights Act of 1975 going back a number of years, see the gray hair, and of what it took to overcome the initial opposition, and in some cases the ongoing opposition, of allies, or folks who should have been allies, from the civil rights community, progressive voices within Congress. So it's somewhat ironic that we have faced something similar in recent years. And that's because MALDEF is at the forefront of the changes that we have attempted now as a civil rights community to put in place for over a decade. So the current effort to expand, if you will, to revise and reauthorize the Voting Rights Act, which hasn't been reauthorized by Congress since 2006, focuses on a piece of legislation now called the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And it was created initially over a decade ago in response to a Supreme Court decision in 2013 called Shelby County versus Holder. And that is a case in which a 5-4 majority of the Supreme Court basically disabled the most important, most effective provision in the Voting Rights Act, and that's Section 5, that required over decades that certain jurisdictions, including the entire state of Texas, pre-clear any voting-related changes before they could implement them. Now, that meant that every redistricting map from the state of Texas had to go through pre-clearance. That meant even an attempt in Bexar County to move a precinct had to go through pre-clearance. And it enabled the Department of Justice, or increasingly because the state of Texas took advantage of the option of going to federal court in Washington, D.C., but it permitted either DOJ or the Washington, D.C. federal court to say no to a number of changes over decades that were contemplated in Texas and other places subject to preclearance. What the Supreme Court did in the Shelby County decision was to strike down the coverage formula for determining which jurisdictions were subject to preclearance. And by doing so, it basically meant nobody was subject to preclearance unless you could obtain a federal court order after a finding of intentional discrimination in voting to order a jurisdiction to be subject to preclearance. Now, that's not easy, I am proud that MALDEF's San Antonio office obtained the first contested pre-clearance court order after Shelby County against Pasadena, Texas, which had attempted to shift from 8 city council districts to 6 districted seats and 2 at-large. The whole purpose of that was to preserve Anglo control of a rapidly changing city that was on the cusp of electing a majority Latino city council. But when you shift 2 of the seats to at-large, you both make the 6 remaining districts bigger, harder to win in, and you also ensure that Anglos will determine who gets elected to those 2 at-large seats. But other than a court order, we were left with nothing, and still are, in terms of preclearance. So the effort to reenact a coverage formula is what's behind the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Initially, the discussion among civil rights groups was about coming up with another formula like the one that had been struck down while attending to the articulated concerns of the Supreme Court majority. So a geographic formula that would again identify specific jurisdictions. In this case, it would be based on a history, a recent history, because the Supreme Court Chief Justice had been explicit that there needed to be recent evidence subjecting these poor states and other jurisdictions to the indignity of having to seek preclearance, whereas their colleagues don't have to seek preclearance. You had the picture of the poor state of Texas going into the cocktail party of all states and feeling ashamed because it was subject to preclearance while other states didn't have to do that. And so they were looking at a formula, and it is now included in the John Lewis Act, that would, again, subject jurisdictions with a recent history of voting discrimination determined by courts to preclearance. And that preclearance would apply to anything voting related that those jurisdictions attempt to do, as the previous formula applied as well. But MALDEF came forward with a supplemental coverage formula. And this has now come to be known as known practices coverage. And we avoid, through known practices coverage, any of that shame and indignity for the states, because known practices coverage would apply to everyone nationwide. But it would not apply to all voting-related changes. It would apply only to certain known practices with a history of being used to suppress minority votes. So things like what Pasadena, Texas did. If any jurisdiction wants to revert to at-large or even partially revert to at-large elections, that would be a practice subject to preclearance. Or in some cases, if you annex or de-annex portions of the population traditionally used to ensure that whites are still in control, that would be subject to preclearance. And preclearance, in this context as in the other, is a review to make sure there's no intentional discrimination behind it and that there's no going backward or retrogressive effect of the change. Known practices also include circumstances that on their face may be innocent, but historically have resulted in decisions that suppress minority votes. So if you are redistricting in a jurisdiction where the last decade saw a significant growth in a minority population, your redistricting would be subject to preclearance. And I derived known practices coverage and we put it forward with specifically the Latino community in mind. Because the problem with the historical formula is that when you're a new population, new to a particular jurisdiction, just reaching critical mass where the powers that be are going to want to suppress your vote, you haven't had the time to acquire the history of adjudicated voting discrimination to subject your jurisdiction to preclearance. So a growing and expanding community like ours, which as we all know is no longer confined just to the Southwest, Chicago, New York, and South Florida. We're everywhere. So we needed a formula that would answer the concerns of a population that was growing without the long history behind it yet of historical voting discrimination. So it was designed particularly for Latinos and now Asian Americans, also growing without the time in particular jurisdictions to acquire the history. So while it was known as known practices coverage and applicable everywhere, the civil rights folks that were discussing the Lewis Act understood that it was designed and put forward by MALDEF, now with the support of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, for these two growing communities. Not going to be as helpful to stable communities that aren't growing as quickly, like the Black community. So when we put this forward, we experienced much of what I had heard from Vilma about 1975, which is within the civil rights circle that was talking about it, there was immediate opposition from a number of groups with the same assertion. Oh, that's unconstitutional. That's even more unconstitutional than what the court struck down in Shelby County versus Holder. There's no such thing as more unconstitutional versus less, but you understand. And I even got yelled at by one Congress member who was a lawyer, a progressive Congress member, who yelled at me that he was a lawyer and he knew that this was unconstitutional. And I explained to him, well, it doesn't have the differential sovereignty concerns, that dignity of the states that are subjected to preclearance versus others, because it applies to everybody. I explained to him it's very much like a permitting scheme. If anybody wants to go do something that's going to have a significant environmental effect on a river, they have to get permission. It's like that. It applies to everybody. You want to do something that has a history of discriminating, you have to get permission. Well, a funny thing happened as more than a decade went by with this law not enacted, and that is the geographic formula, the one that's based on the history of adjudicated discrimination, has become harder and harder to put together with any effect, because there just haven't been the number of court decisions finding intentional voting discrimination that there had been in the past. So that geographic formula now has a shrinking application. And the number of jurisdictions that it would cover has become smaller and smaller, with the consequence that known practices coverage is now the predominant approach in the John Lewis Act to reviving preclearance in Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. But we still have a long way to go to overcome that opposition that again says, oh, but this is going to bring us back to court and they're going to find this unconstitutional and we're going to be worse off than we were before. But lurking behind that, as I think occurred in 75, was a concern about expansion to include the Latino community in a greater way that wasn't necessarily welcome in circles that see civil rights as controversial, and therefore you limit the effect of civil rights laws and you make it less controversial, less likely to attract the opposition of others. So I think 50 years later, MALDEF is in the lead on voting rights reforms designed to modernize the Voting Rights Act, to recognize that we have this huge growth of minority communities in jurisdictions where they were not of significant size even 25 years ago, even 15 years ago. And there is a need to modernize the Voting Rights Act to address that consequence. As I explain this over years to folks, I say if you want to stop the vote killers, you've got to go after both the serial vote killers, that's the states like Texas with a long history of killing votes, but you also got to stop the copycat vote killers. And that's the folks that known practices coverage would get, because they're adopting the practices that have long been used by Texas and others to their new jurisdiction because they perceive the new threat that is us.
So this is why we have to know our history. So many parallels, right, between 1975 and today. Thank you for your advocacy. I want to get back to something that I think is very related, but I want to fast forward to 2024. So there's a lot of disillusionment, a lot of blame going around toward the Latino community for, one, an increased share of support for President Trump, two, being willing in Texas, for example, to vote for a black man for U.S. Senate, but not a black woman for president, and three, the millions of Latino and black voters that stayed home for Vice President Harris in 2024, but who had voted for President Biden in 2020. So how do you respond to some of those criticisms, and what are your takeaways from the 2024 election?
As you know, I really liked that question. Because here's how I think about it. I'm just not into disillusionment or blame, unless I'm, off the record, maybe talking to Tom over a martini. So what it made me think about, Celina, is this. Look, the reality today is that our country is struggling with a very interesting set of facts, and I always look at the facts first. And there's so many forces at work here. We've heard from our keynote speaker this morning about the changed demographics. We know about the women's movement, the gay liberation movement, immigration, affirmative action, DEI. Not to mention the outsized role of money in politics and the years of Republican strategic efforts in local elections. And just look at Project 2025. That didn't come out of the blue in a year. So my thinking is that, and I thought, what do we do if we're not going to get disillusioned? Well, I think we need to have a plan. It's our turn to frame the issues. Don't have them back us into, boys and girls sports. That's just really not the issue. We have to frame the issue. Secondly, we really have to learn to work together. I get fundraising requests from Vote Vets, Emily's List, Southwest Voter Project, MALDEF, the list goes on and on. Somehow all of these important groups need to learn to pool resources and work together. And find groups such as the League of Women Voters, the nonpartisan groups, to work with us on these issues. We need to insist that the Democratic Party finally recognize the importance of on-the-ground funding efforts in voter registration and voter getting out the vote. But hardest of all, I think, is going to be to figure out how do we use the demographic and cultural shifts in our country to breathe life into our democratic institutions and guiding principles. I mean, as a lawyer, to me, it was equality before the law. I expected dignity for me and everybody who looks like me and people who are considered the other, because that is how I was perceived in Texas, and I didn't like it, because I'm just one of many, as we all are, and so that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you. I wonder if you could talk a little bit, and break down what we are still facing, right, in the 2024 election, but just since the VRA, in terms of trends that Latino voters face.
So I think we still have a major turnout problem. We still, through census data, know that Latinos have the biggest gap between eligible participants and actual participants in voting. And there is insufficient investment to shrink that gap. We face that problem because there are a bunch of reform efforts that seek to use alternative election systems as somehow the solution to getting more progressives elected. And these are often progressive, frankly, white-led organizations that are seeking alternative election structures, such as multiple member districts, where you would have 4 or 5 Congress members elected from a super huge district, or similar reforms. And MALDEF ends up being the naysayer in the room in these circumstances, because our view is we will not support such efforts unless and until there's sufficient investment to shrink the turnout gap. Because if you don't shrink the turnout gap, then those alternative election systems don't help us at all. In fact, we do worse off in those circumstances. So we have to address the turnout problem. And I would emphasize that it's not just a matter of underinvestment. It is certainly that in the Latino community. It's frankly a matter of the wrong investments as well, which is the Democratic Party and those wealthy individuals who fund in ways tied to the Democratic Party have chosen to fund organizations that they have long funded to reach the Latino community as well. So they will fund unions, they will fund Black civil rights organizations, and simply ask them to use the extra money they give them to target the Latino community. That's a wrong investment, because they're doing that instead of investing in the groups like Southwest Voter that have the long history with the Latino community and therefore the ability to more efficiently and effectively use the invested dollars to increase the turnout. So we have to fix not just the underinvestment, but the wrong investment by the party. We have still a problem of being compared to the Black community and found wanting, which I've never understood. It is because the Black community votes consistently 80+% for the Democratic Party. So they are viewed as a priority, significant voting bloc. But as Celina mentioned, not only did we become the largest minority group, surpassing Blacks over 20 years ago, we have more recently surpassed Blacks in voting. So Latinos are now the second largest after white voters voting bloc in the country. Now one would think that would be enough. But we're found wanting because Latinos only vote 60+% for Democrats consistently. Now, I tell folks, last time I checked, 60% is a landslide in any election you can imagine. But somehow we're lacking because we're not at the 80% when we are compared to the Black community. And I think that has resulted in neglect by the Democratic Party of the Latino community. I think part of what happened in 2024, and frankly more than any appeal of Donald Trump, is disillusionment with Joe Biden. And Kamala Harris was associated with Joe Biden because the Biden administration, frankly, was, in my estimation, the worst Democratic administration for the Latino community in my memory. And that's saying a lot. But I'll give you just one example of great concern to MALDEF. In the end, the Biden administration appointed a number of federal life tenure judges. It appointed Black judges at a rate that is 2 to 3 times parity with their population proportion. It appointed Asian American justices at a rate that is 3 to 4 times population parity. Latinos are the only racial minority group that was appointed at a rate that is below population parity in the end. Close, but below population parity. So Biden administration appointed judges for other minority groups at multiple times their population percentage. It couldn't even get to equaling the population percentage of Latinos in its judicial appointments. Now, folks will say, well, voters don't pay much attention to judicial appointments. But that is an illustration of the sense that voters in the Latino community had about how much Joe Biden cared about them, cared about their issues, cared about their concerns. Because we could all cite our own examples like that. So the problem is largely with the attention of the folks who should be exploiting our votes. By my calculation, and maybe I have this wrong, I have an expert statistician who can make sure I'm right, but my calculation, if you increase the turnout in a group that turns out for you at 60%, that's pretty good. That's a group whose turnout you should be prioritizing, because you can't do much better than 60% in favor of you and 40% for your opponent. So I certainly recognize that a large part of our problem in civil rights relates to the folks on the other side. But it's often our friends, as with the 75 Voting Rights Act and the current experience and these issues of Latino turnout, it's often our friends that are not so friendly or so helpful as we need them to be.
Thank you for sharing that important perspective. And so a lack of investment, a disinterest in investment, I think you've also framed the dilution, denial, deterrence of our vote as key parts of people on the other side, right? Can you talk a little bit about what that still looks like and what the legal landscape is, in addition to the Shelby County case that you mentioned?
Well, it is a situation where we are creating differential voting systems state by state, because there are some states, like my home state of California, that have done everything they can to expand participation. Same-day voting registration, as you mentioned, Celina, and online voting registration, and being able to vote remotely regardless of circumstances. And then there are states, unfortunately, Texas is in the lead on this side, that are taking every opportunity to advance legislation that would restrict the opportunity to participate by reducing the opportunity to vote remotely, even when that would enable lots of working class folks, lots of folks with family obligations that are very demanding to participate when they can't get to the polls on the one election day. At the same time, we see, as you know, a proliferation of restrictions on those who seek to assist people in registering, people in casting a ballot. We see criminalization attempts on those who are helping to facilitate participation, and they give it bad names like vote harvesting. Not sure why that's a bad name. Every other kind of harvest that I can think of is something you celebrate, but vote harvesting is now a bad thing, and you're going to be at risk of a raid of your home and being prosecuted if you engage in vote harvesting. But we also have to recognize that what they are doing extends well beyond what we traditionally would call voter suppression efforts. We know that we are facing with the census attempts to disenfranchise the Latino community, not just to have the community undercounted. As we heard, Latinos were severely undercounted in the last census, and a lot of it had to do with what Director Santos talked about, the reputation that unfortunately got stuck to the Bureau because of all of the media attention around the citizenship question. But it gets worse. So last decade, in 2018, the state of Alabama filed a lawsuit arguing that undocumented immigrants should be discounted entirely from the population counts used to reapportion the House of Representatives. As Director Santos indicated, that's why we have a census. That's the one reason why we have a census in the Constitution, is to reapportion the House of Representatives. But Alabama argued, and they're not the first or the last, that undocumented immigrants should be discounted. So here we are earlier in the decade, and the state of Louisiana has already filed the same lawsuit. They filed it earlier because they recognized and learned, apparently, from the Alabama experience, that they don't have the data. The Bureau doesn't have the data. The federal government doesn't have the data to discount the undocumented population. I think in the end, we understood the only thing that could be reliably counted was undocumented folks who are being detained. But apart from that, you could not get, under current administrative records, an accurate or anywhere close to accurate number of folks to then be discounted in the reapportionment count. So implicitly, Louisiana is not just aiming to get a ruling that says you don't count the undocumented in reapportioning the House of Representatives. They want to put not just a citizenship question on the 2030 census, but a status question on the 2030 census. Because a citizenship question doesn't go far enough to identify the undocumented. They need a status question so they can determine who is undocumented in each household and discount them from the apportionment count. So this is a bigger fight than we faced last decade when, as you heard earlier, the Trump administration attempted late to put a citizenship question on the 2020 census. They're starting earlier, and they want more than a citizenship question. In addition, they're going to do what they did last decade, try to create, through that citizenship question, a database down to the block level that would permit any state or other jurisdiction to equalize districts. We're now talking about redistricting, not reapportionment of the House seats, but when you're actually drawing the maps, they want them to be able to equalize voters, not total population, district by district. Now, the whole purpose of that is to reduce Latino representation because it not only discounts non-citizens when you're making the districts equal, roughly equal in voter population, it also discounts anybody under 18. And in our community, that's a bigger proportion than other communities. So you discount those who are not yet 18, you discount those who are not citizens, and you do this for a whole decade, by the way, despite the fact that people can naturalize after 3 to 5 years of being a lawful permanent resident. And we all know that a child who's 8, when the census occurs, is going to be a voter by the time the next census occurs. But they discount all of those above 8 to 18 in this proposal. And again, they need the citizenship question to create the database at a level of granularity required to draw districts. So there's already nefarious activity going on about the census in 2030 that is about suppressing Latino political power and vote.
And I think it's fitting that we're in Texas for this conversation because cases in Texas represent more than the other cases in the other VRA expanded jurisdictions in the Southwest combined. And of course, the Texas Latino Redistricting Task Force, MALDEF, has been fighting decade after decade on Texas redistricting.
Yeah, they're in trial now, by the way, in case you didn't know. The trial finally for the redistricting after the 2020 census is occurring now in El Paso before a 3-judge panel. It's not a great panel, so we'll have to see what the outcome is of that particular case, but it's an important fight to wage given the size and importance of the state of Texas, as you mentioned.
And one, of course, important voter suppression tactic has been proof of citizenship when Latinos are registering, when people are registering to vote, and that's been particularly harmful against Latinos. We've seen Texas try to do that for a long time in other states, but there's a recent, of course, executive order by President Trump trying to do the same for federal elections. Can you talk a little bit about how they justify that, what harm that is doing, and where that's at in the litigation process?
Well, as you mentioned, it's all about the myth of voter fraud, the widespread, increasingly talked about complete mythology that there are huge numbers of non-citizen voters casting ballots. No indication of that occurring other than in isolated incidents, frankly, generally out of ignorance rather than intent, where a non-citizen who is on the cusp of naturalization may believe that they have the right to vote, even though they haven't actually taken the oath of citizenship yet. But this voter fraud myth is what's behind the notion that we need to start asking for proof of citizenship before you register. We need to have voter IDs that are curiously limited. Texas, most infamously, not including student IDs, but including, gun permits that are included for your acceptable ID to vote. But it's all driven by this disinformation, because it is intentional disinformation, that somehow there is a huge voter fraud problem in this country. There isn't. I guarantee you Donald Trump would not have received a majority of the votes in 2020 under any circumstances, despite his assertion that it's millions of undocumented voters who took the popular vote majority away from him in 2016, rather. So that myth continues to survive despite all evidence that it doesn't exist.
The state rep, I was with Nina Perales, who of course many of you know as MALDEF's Vice President of Litigation, one of the top voting rights lawyers in the country, and she was being asked by a Texas state rep, so are we just imagining this voter fraud? Is this just rainbows and unicorns? First of all, rainbows are real, and some people think unicorns are real, but but Nina was like, that's exactly what I'm saying, is that they're, it is largely fabricated. So I'm definitely interested in seeing how that litigation progresses. I want to do, Sarah, quick time check, because we have a couple of other questions, but I want to make sure. Okay, so Vilma, one of your incredible legacies that we have seen across the nation and that's including in solidly red states, is that Latinos are getting elected. They are leading Latino-led democracies in our communities, and I think we should all be so proud of that legacy. We owe so much of that to you and the work of your contemporaries, but some people fear our power, and so we're seeing anti-democracy tactics like laws that would undermine local control by preempting city ordinances. We also see attempts that to undermine the ability of Latino voters to elect candidates of their choice. So, for example, here in Texas, we have policies that try to unseat through removal of office procedures Latino DAs, Latino county attorneys, and other elected officials through very draconian policies. And I'm just wondering what your perspective is on how do we help our community connect those dots between those type of policies and really the attempts to thwart the will of the voters?
Well, it's clear from everything we've been talking about that there's a very concerted, creative effort to undermine our power, our right to vote. And I think the only way to combat that is by continuing the work of education. People need to know what is going on, whether it's in the schools or whether it's in supporting MALDEF and the Southwest Voter Project activities, signing up for League of Women Voters volunteer efforts. ARP does a lot of this. We need to stay informed. I consider myself fairly well informed, and yet I learned a lot from listening to Tom today. And so I was really smart to leave when I did and make sure that MALDEF had terrific successors to carry on this role. But all kidding aside, it just is going to require commitment, because whatever challenge is there, it is our job to meet it, because I don't know that I see another option, because I believe this is our country, and I believe this is our time.
Very well said, and I think that's a great place to open it up for any questions from the audience. I think that there is a microphone that can be passed around for anyone that wants to ask questions of Vilma.
So while we find a question, I just wanted to say I think it's the height of irony that it is the party that has been traditionally the champion of local control that is now shifted entirely. The party of states' rights wants to take away the rights of states and hand them to the president, and it wants to allow states to take the local power, as you indicated, Celina, away from local government and house it with the state. So this is a shift. in the political ideology of this country. It's quite ironic.
Thank you, Tom. And we have one question over there. Do you have a let's see. Here, hi, Elaine. I'm like, I see you, the light's in my eyes, but I can see you.
I wonder if the panelists would. I wonder if the panelists would take a turn at analyzing the Latino voters who went for Trump in the last election and continue to support him, even as policies are detrimental to the Latino community. Well, I'll take a crack at that. It does go into the 60 versus 80% is part of the answer. That's always been true. But 60% is still very high. You know, people just need to be told what's what. And other people, and people are entitled to have their own thoughts, which is why I think the value of education is so important. People need to understand by supporting Trump, what they think they're voting for isn't always what they're getting. And I think more and more people are starting to see that, right? So I think that's the approach to take, as opposed to saying, you know, you're horrible or whatever. Don't you understand what's going on here?
And I would start by saying I don't think that support will last. I think that the Trump administration has gone too far, too extreme. Its own extremism is going to alienate the youth vote, for example. We saw a shift in the youth vote in 2024. I don't think that will endure. I think that much of the Latino vote for Trump will diminish over time. But the question and what we saw in 2024 does raise a serious concern. We know that in this country, white working class men have long voted against their own interests. Right? And so what's behind that? There's one analysis that says they're voting their aspirations, no matter how unrealistic they are, rather than their reality. And the danger is that we end up with Latino men who vote their aspirations, thinking they're going to be Trump someday in the future, versus their reality. And I think that we have to, in our community, while we have long thrived on the aspirations of immigrants in our community, the aspirations of parents for their kids in our community, we do have some work to do to make sure that people vote based on their reality and what's going to happen as a result of the policies that they are empowering.
But, you know, and just to add something to that, I think my point about we need to frame the issues, I think somehow we've lost the framing, right? And it seems to me if we can frame the issues, not just aspiration, but reality, where are you today? And then what are the policies that will help you and your family? We've let the Republicans take too much airtime on that, and the media's given them too much airtime. And it's shocking to me how much space this one person, Trump, occupies, right? All those flurry of executive orders, most of which are not ever going to be implemented really, but it just creates this chaos that he's thriving in. I don't know how much longer he will thrive in that environment, because certainly all these tariff policies and combined with those executive orders, it's not really benefiting our country. It's not benefiting the image of our country worldwide. And I think, the going after the universities, it just makes no sense. Going after the tiny agency AID, which has gotten us so much what we call soft power goodwill throughout the world. We need to go on the offensive, is basically what I'm saying. We need to frame the issue.
I saw Sarah with a microphone. I think we have a...
Hi, everybody. Sonia Diaz. Hi, Tom. Hi, Vilma. So my question is really thinking about the theme that got us here, which was Section 203 and the promise of Latino political inclusion by the ability to fully participate. And I'd love for you to think, now that we're 50 years out from that, in looking at states like California and Texas that now have Latino pluralities, New Mexico, which has had a majority, you look at Illinois and some other states where Latinos join African Americans or Asian Americans to be a multiracial kind of plurality. And yet you don't see the ascension of Latinos, not necessarily just limited to electoral power, whether it's statewide constitutional office, but in terms of the other aspects that dictate our days and our lives. Being in charge of hospitals, being in charge of universities, in charge of philanthropy, in the C-suite. So as we look at this moment that we're in right now, which has a myriad of challenges that are seismic, what are the opportunities that we can glean from the civil rights movement for this moment of the future that has widespread technological change, climate disaster, othering? What's the goal right now? And then I'd love to think through, what's the role of MALDEF in that future?
Before the role, Tom, you take the role of MALDEF. It's your turn. But I would say this, before we get too carried away, you know what? I'm 81 years old. When I look at where we were when I was a girl here in San Antonio, unable to sit in the downstairs when I would go to the movies, when I couldn't go to the swimming pool in Landa Park. When I was head of MALDEF, we didn't have Chicano studies programs and policy institutes developing all of this data to use. We had to do it without that. We have a lot of that now. We have it. So I don't want us to shortchange what we have accomplished, because a lot has been done. Interestingly, the minute you go forward a bit, there will be backward movement. Think about when you look at what civil rights accomplished, they did a lot. We elected a black president. We thought we had it made, right? Wrong, right? It created an incredible backlash. I think we're in that backlash at the moment. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a wealth of support that we can use and utilize to move forward, to reframe the debate, to go forward. So that's my thought. But Tom will decide what MALDEF should do.
No, I think that your emphasis in the question on inclusion in leadership is the overarching challenge that our community faces. And I think there are a number of things behind that. I talked about judicial appointments. There is an impression, I don't think grounded in reality, but an impression by elected officials, including some of our own, that we in the Latino community won't demand equitable inclusion in the way that other communities do. I've seen it when I was in government very briefly. Elected officials would not think of not including the black community on any body you mention because they know they'll be held accountable by that community. They don't have that impression of us. So, Sonia, as you know, because you're from California, great progressive state, Latino plurality. We are the only racial ethnic group, aside from Native Americans, in California that has been limited to one California state Supreme Court justice at a time. Every other community, smaller, all of them, has had more. Obviously, throughout most of history, a 7-member court was all white, so 7 white people at one time on that court. There are currently actually 3 black justices on the California Supreme Court. There have historically, 10, 15 years ago, been 4 Asian American justices on that court at the same time. Latinos are the only group, though we are the largest, surpassed whites a decade plus ago, that has ever been confined to only 1 justice at a time. But the community in California is not rallying around that. Now, why is that? Hard to say. But behind what you're talking about is also a need to recognize, and this transitions into the MALDEF role, that the assault on DEI is about us. Okay? It's not about other communities. It's about our growth and what that growth will translate into if efforts to make sure there's greater equity and inclusion continue. And I'm going to do a little aside, because I do this all the time. I'm trying to get people not to focus on diversity, as important as it is. We actually inherited that from a very conservative Justice Lewis Powell in the Bakke case, who said that's the only acceptable constitutional reason for considering race in admissions. But we should all lead with equity. So I want us all to say EID, equity, inclusion, and diversity. And here's the good thing, EID also is an acronym for Ending Irrational Discrimination, because that's what it's about. Trump wants us to think that DEI is the discrimination against those poor oppressed white men, when in fact DEI is about ending irrational discrimination where it is embedded in our systems. So we have to be the champions. MALDEF has to be the champion of EID, because it is about us. We are the threat they perceive.
Tom, thank you for advocating equity. Vilma, thank you for reminding us to play the long game, because we are in it to win it. Please, everyone, give a huge round of applause for Vilma and Tom. We see y'all's sacrifice. We see your relentless advocacy and your legacy. And thank you, MACRI, so much. It's lunchtime, so I'm going to turn it over to Sarah for that important PSA.
Such intellectual power up here. Yes. And I know there were a few more people who wanted to ask questions, but I have the difficult job of trying to keep us on schedule. So we are going to break for lunch in just a minute, and there will be plenty of time for conversation and questions and socializing when we break for lunch. But I want to go back to something that Celina said right at the beginning, and that's once a Maldefian, always a Maldefian. There are a number of Maldefians here in the audience. I'm wondering if you are a Maldefian, past, present, could you please stand and be recognized? I see here Mario Obledo Jr., son of one of the founders of MALDEF. Yes. I see Al Kaufman, legendary civil rights lawyer. I'm so sorry. We've also got a number of people from Southwest Voter here, Lydia Camarillo, Andy Hernandez, and Manuel Garza. I see past chair of MALDEF, the legendary lawyer, Frank Herrera. And I see the current chair of MALDEF, Norma Cantu. Did I miss?